Hi, my name is Marsha Lehman, and I'm a Knox County Master Gardener. Today we're going to do the second of the basic presentations on Prune Like a Pro. The first one was on basic rules. This one is on basic tools. For 2021, we have an entire series called Prune Like a Pro, and as we go throughout the year, we will be doing short videos on how to prune specific plants. But before we start any of these specific plants, we wanted to address basic rules and basic tools. And as I mentioned, today is basic tools. So, which pruning tool to use? The real determining factor is how big of a cut are you going to make? So let's start with, if you watch basic rules, we only use shears on hedges. They can be electric for the basic shaping and then manual for the finishing touch. But again, hedges are the only thing you ever use shears to prune. And all the other pruning is really a selective pruning on plants that are not hedges. And hand pruners, as shown in the picture here, are good on branches that are up to about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. If you've got really strong hands and a large pair of hand pruners, you might go you might go up to an inch. But loppers are recommended for wood that's an inch to inch and a half. An inch and a half is a tough cut to make with loppers, but if you've got a really strong pair, really sharp pair, and a lot of upper body strength, you can do that. Let's continue. As the cut gets bigger, once you're over that inch, inch and a half, where you were using loppers, then you really want to move to a saw. So here on the left, we've got a small hand saw. I have one that the blade folds up into the handle, which is nice for storing and for carrying around. And that's also good for getting into relatively tight spaces. Then there's a bow saw, which really has teeth that will rip through that inch and a half to 2-inch diameter limb. But as you can see from the size of it, it's sometimes hard to get it into a space. So there may be times where you really want to use this bow saw on the right, but because the branches are so close together, you end up having to use something like the hand saw over here on the left. And then once you get greater than 2 to 3 inches, you definitely need a saw, and you need to do what's called a 3-cut method, which is demonstrated here. We're not going to elaborate on that because that comes in the actual pruning talks. Or that's the point at which you want to call an arborist. Not just any tree service, but somebody that has a certified arborist on staff and who knows how to make good lateral pruning cuts. Which pruners to buy? So let's come back to the selective stuff. We're not going to talk about saws today. We're just going to talk about pruners and loppers, because that's what we use for most of our smaller, more numerous, and very selective pruning. When we get to hand pruners, the picture shows what is called a bypass pruner, and that happens to be my favorite. I have several pair here with me. This happens to be my favorite pair. Versus an anvil pruner. And I have an old pair here that I actually bought at a thrift store to keep as a demonstration item. And the difference is that on a anvil pruner, this bottom part is flat and the blade comes down and basically crushes whatever you're cutting. There are some folks who like that for cutting back flowers, and if you're cutting dead wood, folks claim that they may actually be better because it crushes and kind of closes the end. In the pruning that I do, I don't really care to crush the branches, so I always stick to the bypass pruners. And if you get confused between bypass and anvil, just think of what an anvil looks like and how you come down and you hammer on the anvil. That is how an anvil pruner works. The bottom is flat. whereas a bypass pruner looks more like a pair of scissors, and the two components go past each other and make a very clean cut. So your first decision is, do I want a bypass pruner or an anvil pruner? And in most cases, you would want a bypass pruner. The really big question is, how does it fit in your hand? I've had lots of people ask me where I buy tools. Well, occasionally I will buy a pruner online, but I have learned, for instance, I bought a pair online that are super, super sharp, great pair of pruners, but they're actually just too big for my hand. So I do carry these in my tool tote because I volunteer at a community garden, but this is a pair that I would lend to a guy who generally has bigger hands than I have. I have another smaller pair because we also sometimes get teenagers and children around. So these easily fit in my hand, and they have the standard little spring here in the center. That's the first part that usually gives away, but these are very inexpensive pruners. And so again, I carry them with me to a community garden. For the folks who are snipping herbs and flowers and the like, again, this is a bypass pruner, but it's got really pointy blades on it. So be careful how you carry that around. But it's got the same spring in the mechanism in the middle. But people doing herbs and deadheading flowers tend to like something like this. But me, I come back to, I found this pair I purchased in a store where I could actually put it in my hand, see how hard it was to work, and say, could I go out and do an hour or 2 hours worth of pruning with this pair of pruners without wearing myself out? And it's got the telescoping type spring in the middle rather than a coil spring. Cutting capacity. Also, you can imagine these little pointy things that I showed you can't cut nearly this. You could not make a 1/2 inch cut with this. I can make a 1/2 inch cut with these. But not only is it the cutting capacity of the pruner, but is your grip strong enough to make that cut? Comfort, how's it feel in your hand? So until you find a pruner that you really like, I would suggest that you go into a store or you go to, sometimes there are gardening shows where they'll have tools available. You can go, actually put them in your hand, try them. And then if you know the make model, yeah, then you can go and buy it online. The blade material, the harder the material, in which cases there are some aluminum ones, which are fairly soft, but the harder the material, like a hardened steel, the harder the material on the blade, the better it holds a sharp edge. The softer the material, the more quickly it gets dull, but it's also easier to sharpen. So then you just carry a sharpening device with you. If you are one of those folks who tends to misplace pruners, you might consider buying a holster. This is the one that I carry. I'll put my pruners back in there. But you can wear this, you can slide a belt through here, but since I don't typically wear a belt, I got a holster that has a clip on the back, which then I just stick down in my pocket. And so I rarely leave the house headed for the garden without having that hanging on my pocket. And then as I take my cup of coffee and go walk around and check on the garden, if I see something that just needs a little cleanup, well, I've got my pruners right on me. I have a couple snips and boom, I'm done. And then there's the issue of price. As I mentioned, some of these that I showed you are relatively inexpensive. And if you're going to a community garden and lending out your tools to other volunteers, then yeah, don't go buy the really, really pricey ones that you're going to lend out, because sometimes they don't come back, or sometimes they get left in the garden and discovered a week later, or sometimes they're just not careful, and in the process of trying to prune something, they also pruned the trellis to which the thing was growing. So price is a very personal decision. buy the best ones you can afford and then take good care of them. Loppers are kind of the same thing. They come in a range starting with about 1 inch and up to maybe 1.5 inches, 1 3/4. But the larger the cutting capacity, the stronger you need to be. And you've got the same issue of how long can you go out and use this tool? Now, the pair that I've shown here on the bottom photo has this ratchet assist, and that makes the cut a little easier, but that's the plus. But the downside to that is it also makes the tool heavier. So unless you're going to make a lot of these cuts, it's a real trade-off between making the cut easier and having a heavier tool that you're lugging around for who knows how long. Also, the length of the handles, the longer is important, because the longer the handle, the more leverage you get in making that cut. So I've got a pair of loppers that have maybe a 12-inch handle that I use when I need more than a hand pruner, but I don't have room to open up a really, really long handle pruner in the space. But most of the time when I go out with a pair of loppers, I'm using the ones that have the longest handles. If I need to come back and pick up the shorter handled lopper, then I'll do that. And again, depending on how much you're going to use a tool like this, you can decide how much you want to spend. So you can find some inexpensive loppers, $20, and you can find really pricey loppers for $200. But for selective pruning, we're using things like hand pruners and loppers. Taking care of those tools, if you're going to spend good money, you certainly want to take care of them. So we generally recommend that you sanitize before you start pruning, because how long have the tools been sitting around getting dusty in the garage, or what did you cut the last time? And if you can't really remember what you were working on, just play it safe and sanitize before you start. And definitely, if you're pruning away any diseased material, you want to sanitize your pruners as you move from one plant to the next plant to make sure that you're not transferring that disease from one plant to the next. The first plant may be diseased, the second plant might not be, and the last thing you want to do is be the cause of some disease in that second plant. You can use rubbing alcohol. There's 70% alcohol, there's 90% alcohol. My preference is Lysol, disinfectant in a spray bottle. You can get these things also in wipes. You can get alcohol wipes and Lysol wipes, disinfectant wipes, those things that say kill 99% of germs. Again, it's your choice. There are folks who will put some of the solution in a bottle and then dip their tools in it. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, and I've knocked over a bottle or two of that stuff. So I like the spray bottles that I can either hang over the side of the tote into which I'm putting all my clippings, or hang on a trellis as I'm moving down a row of trellised plants. But sanitizing them is really important. Make sure your tools are sharp. Dull cuts can crush, and that can actually cause additional damage, and that can create a wound for further disease. So how do you know if your tool is sharp? Okay, the thing you do, here's my pruners. I'm going to leave them closed, but the way you decide if your pruners are sharp is, actually I will open it, you run your finger across the blade, not along the blade. If you run your finger along the blade, you will slice it wide open unless they are absolutely positively dull. But if you run it across and it feels smooth, it's dull. If you have a little bit of friction as you run your finger across the blade, then you're nice and sharp. How do you sharpen it? Well, with any number of things. My choice is this little sharpening device, the one in the in the photo says Corona, but lots of different people make these. Mine happens to be called a Speedy Sharp, but it works the same way. And I take 4 or 5 strokes along the beveled edge of the blade and 1 stroke on the backside to remove any little burrs. Now that's for routine. If you let your tools get really, really dull, it may take you more than 4 or 5 strokes. But again, every time I've had a major pruning session, when I finish, I come in and I sanitize them, I resharpen them, and that's how I get away with 4 or 5 strokes. And then oil lightly, and in fact, my favorite oil, I have a very old can of 3-in-1 oil from who knows when, because the label actually says 2 guys, and they're no longer in business. There are lots of other sharpening devices. You may have seen, this one's called Garden Sharp, but you may have seen something like this. It's got this V-shaped sharpener on the end of it. I don't like that for my pruners because I can't get it all the way into the center of the pruner, right? So I can't get the whole thing in there. So I actually like this for sharpening some weeding tools, but I don't use it on my pruners. And if you have a woodworker in your household, you can actually use a stone. And these are generally used for sharpening things like chisels. So if you've got a woodworker in your family, you can find a sharpening stone, a honing stone, and you can use those. But really, these little things cost about $10. You keep it in your toolkit and you're good to go. In addition to taking care of your tools, take care of yourself. So when you go out to prune, there's some personal protective equipment. With COVID-19, we've all heard the term PPE. We now know what that means. But when we used to talk about PPE in pruning, folks didn't know what we meant. So there's PPE for pruning. So if it's a sunny day, wear sunscreen. Don't come back in sunburned and sore and suffer for the next several days. Wear safety goggles or safety glasses, or if you've got polycarbonate lenses, but cover your eyes. Wear gloves. Now this is your choice. Most of the time I wear these gloves in the first photo, which are the nitrile coated gloves. But if I'm working with anything thorny, then I want either a leather glove or a very heavy duck cloth type material that thorns are less likely to penetrate. A thorn will get you with the nitrile gloves. A thorn is less likely to come through a leather glove or a heavy cotton duck cloth. And then if you're really into the briars, for instance, doing roses or barberry, you probably want a pair of gloves that have a much longer cuff because you'll be reaching into the middle to thin it out for air and sunshine. Wear a hat or a cap. A baseball cap is great. I happen to wear a fairly large brimmed hat all the way around. And let me tell you why I do this. Because several years ago, I was out pruning. It was a warm day. I was not wearing a hat. And I scratched my glasses. Now, I wear bifocals with a strong prescription. And so that was a really expensive mistake. So now I wear a hat. In fact, I wear a hat most of the time when I'm in the garden, but I always wear a hat when I'm pruning because when I'm reaching into a shrub, that branch is going to hit my hat first, front, side, back, before it gets my glasses. So that's kind of my warning to back up and reposition myself. But a baseball cap would work just as well. I just happen to wear a very broad rimmed hat and give myself a good case of hat hair. Knee pads or kneeling pads. Some folks like knee pads because you don't have to move them. They're attached to your knees. I actually prefer to use a kneeling pad because sometimes I actually end up sitting on it. And that way I have the choice. But yes, it means I have to move it every time I shift position. If you're actually going to be cutting some branches that are overhead, then invest $10 or $15 and buy a hard hat. There is no excuse for taking a really good conk on the head. And last but not least, use an insect repellent, especially if you know you are allergic to certain bites or stings. And again, that's a personal thing. You may use an insect repellent just to keep the mosquitoes off of you, but if you know you're allergic to bees or some other insect, by all means, wear an insect repellent. Wear long sleeves, wear long pants, make sure you've got your skin covered. So to wrap this up, pruners are your #1 tool. Most pruning cuts that we're making, if you watch the basic rules, are selective cuts. And most of those are made with pruners and loppers because they're the smaller ones, they're the ones you make more often. You get into the bigger tools when you're making bigger cuts, and we hope that you're pruning on a regular enough basis that you don't really need those big tools very often. Buy the best tools that you can afford, but by all means consider comfort and how they fit. If you're a small person, then you may want smaller tools. If you're a really strong person, well, then you can take those loppers that have the ratchet assist because you can wield those. Remember that shears are only used on hedges, and shearing is by definition a non-selective pruning. If you take care of your tools, they will last a lifetime. And by all means, don't skimp on the personal protective gear. So that's the basic tools. There aren't a whole lot. Yes, we could get into pole pruners, and somebody is likely to ask about chainsaw. That's not really pruning. So we're talking about the type of ongoing regular pruning, and that's generally done with hand tools. So if you haven't already watched the basic rules video, I strongly encourage you to do that. And then stay tuned for the pruning videos that are coming in the rest of the Prune Like a Pro series, where each video will be on a specific type of plant. And I can tell you that based on the level of interest, hydrangeas will definitely be one of them. We will do a number of other specific plants, but just stay tuned, and as the pruning season is appropriate, we will be doing individual pruning videos on specific plants. And thank you for joining me on the basic tools.